ladies and gentlemen, Anna Debenham.
Thanks for bearing with me. There's a problem with this monitor, so if you can see it, if you could just look at this one's fine, it's just cut off at the bottom a bit. So my talk probably isn't going to be as exciting as Vitaly's because it's about documentation. Documentation, you know, it's not as exciting as responsive design and all those lovely email hacks, which were actually horrendous. But I'm sure you've all had this experience where you launch a site and it was really, really hard work, and it was worth it though because it looks amazing and it's a work of art and the team is happy and you're so proud, and you put it on your portfolio site and you move on to the next project. And then a few months later, some new designers and developers, they come in and they make some little adjustments, and they use styles that don't fit with the content. They add huge images that slow the site down and throw in a bunch of fonts, and it looks terrible. So you quietly remove the site from your portfolio. But whose fault is this? The next person who works on your site isn't going to be a mind reader. They're not going to know why you've made certain decisions. If they're very new, they might not even know about best practices like optimizing images or why it's bad to use lots of web fonts. That's why we create documentation. Explaining where and when different pieces of content should be used forces you to think about the site as a system rather than a series of pages. And the act of writing it also forces you to think about why you're doing things in a certain way. And this is where style guides come in. Style guides are a type of documentation that encourages people, be they designers, developers, or content producers, to follow a set of rules that help maintain consistency. And there are actually many different types of style guide, which I'll very briefly walk you through. So you've probably all seen branding guidelines. These often go into obsessive detail about logo placement, color usage, and typography. They're not that helpful to us because they're usually entirely geared towards print, with the white space around the logo unhelpfully noted in millimeters and the color scheme in Pantones, which never translate that well to the web. Then there are print guidelines, which go into even more detail. So this is one of the many print guidelines for the UK's National Health Service. That's our public health service. And they have over 1 million employees. It's important for a big organisation like the NHS to have these so that people trust the message that's being communicated, and also to make sure that the design is created in a way that is accessible to as many people as possible. With any organisation this big, it's quite common for these guidelines to be ignored, which is bad if you're trying to communicate a message that could be the difference between life and death. So I want to be sure that this defibrillator is going to work when I use it, and having such a playful font is, I just worry about what I'm going to find when I open that box. Content guidelines focus on the way in which it's appropriate to communicate. So when you've got lots of people working on a project, it's important that you sound consistent with the brand. So MailChimp, they have their own guidelines, which they've called voice and tone. And their recommended message for a success dialogue is, fine piece of work, you totally deserve a raise. And it fits in with MailChimp's kind of fun and quirky brand. That tone of voice is likely to be very different to the way that your bank tells you that your payment has gone through. Content guidelines also help keep language consistent with the house style, from whether a word such as email should have a hyphen in it, to what overused phrases to avoid. So The Guardian and Observer's style guide was the first to appear publicly on the web. They're both newspapers, and they have a lot of journalists, so they wanted to make sure that it was as easy as possible for their journalists to check the style guide, whether they're writing a story in the office or on the road. We have similar guidelines for code as well. When there are multiple developers working on the same project, it's good to maintain a consistent style to the way that you write code to avoid conflicts and to make it easier for everyone to know where things live. And finally, there are style guides built specifically for websites, which I often refer to as front-end style guides. And these are what I'll be focusing on. They'll often contain a mixture of all the ones I just showed you, and unlike a regular style guide, they're interactive. You can hover over a link and it will change state, and you can highlight the text. It's like an instruction manual for building and maintaining a specific website. There isn't a specific type of front-end style guide that is going to fit every project. There are many different techniques for building up a style guide for the web. And I'm still going to show you a couple of techniques that are aimed specifically at designers, along with ones more for developers. Front-end style guides need investment from the whole team, designers and developers, to be useful. If you have an existing site that you want to create a style guide from, or just consolidate styles, the first thing that you can try is something called an interface inventory. So Brad Frost came up with the term, and to demonstrate it, he went to his bank's website, and very simply, he took screenshots of all the different styles of buttons on the website that he could find. And there are dozens, and this is just for one site, one brand. Imagine how much CSS there is just for these button styles. An interface inventory is really easy to do. You're basically going to go through the site like you would a content audit and gather as many different styles as possible, group them by function, and put them all on a slide deck. But don't just stop at buttons. You can also create inventories of all of these different elements. If you're trying to convince someone of the value of creating a style guide for a site, do a quick interface inventory on it to highlight just how much could be consolidated. Explain that consolidating these styles will help make the code leaner and the site more visually coherent and easier to maintain. This is only practical if you have an existing site, but let's say you want to start from scratch or completely revamp a current design. So Samantha Warren is a web designer with a background in art. She quickly realized that creating beautiful website mockups at the start of a project and presenting them to the stakeholder was wasting a lot of time, because sometimes the visual style that she'd come up with was completely not what the client was hoping for. But it wasn't until she'd shown them something that they started talking about what they did want. So she was trying to think of a way to facilitate this conversation about design without creating a pixel-perfect mock-up. She then tried creating mood boards for clients, mood boards like you would use for interior design, but she found them too abstract a tool. They felt too disconnected from a website, and clients would often already have a mood board made as part of a rebranding exercise. So then she created style tiles. They're in between mood boards and mock-ups, and they contain snippets of design elements, but they're not presented like a website. It's meant as a tool for conversation rather than a fixed deliverable. So they're less risky than presenting a finished comp to a client. Since they're quick to make, you can create a few for the client to choose from and ask them, is this the impression that you're going for? They remove that dangerous big reveal stage of a project where the client takes one look at your hard work and says, no, that's not us at all. So here's how a style tile is put together. The most important aspect of a style tile are these words that are used to describe the feeling that the design should evoke, and each tile has different words. So one might say conservative, whereas another style might say modern. These words influence the typography that's chosen, which is also different for each tile. And there are some small design snippets to give a very rough idea of what the design elements will look like in practice. The color palette is shown, and each style tile has a version number. After coming up with a style tile that the client liked, Samantha was then able to work on a mock-up incorporating these styles, and this is what it looks like. You can even choose a tile to form the beginnings of your front-end style guide before the bulk of the design work has even started. Dan Moore has a very similar approach called element collages. So like style tiles, they're a tool to facilitate conversation, but they come a little bit further along in the design process, or even straight after a tile has been selected. And here's what one looks like. It's not a mock-up of a page, it's a digital scrapbook of ideas. And here Dan is prototyping some styles for how the buttons will work and how the donation fields will look. And this technique is perfect for those of you who aren't comfortable putting designs straight into code, but want to move away from doing full comps. The most valuable thing that element collages do is that they focus the client on how that feature will work, regardless of what size screen it's on. Now that we have an infinite number of devices and screen sizes and resolutions to worry about, breaking out of the canvas entirely helps the designer and the client think more about how something is going to work in context of the site of a whole, rather than on a specific page. Design agency ClearLeft have been trying out element collages in their design phase. One problem that they encountered, though, was that their explorations were looking too much like pages, and the client didn't really understand what they were being shown. So as you can see in this collage, although the various modules shown wouldn't all be found on the same page, it still looks too website-like. So they found a better way to present element collages was on a wide horizontal canvas rather than a long vertical one. So this is an element collage that John Azelwood of ClearLeft worked on for Code for America. So here he's thinking about how the block quotes will look, and he's toying with two very different styles that he's going to ask the client their opinion about. And this technique is perfect for designers who don't want to put their design straight into code, but want to move away from presenting full mock-ups. Both style tiles and element collages are intended as discussion pieces. There's a sensible trend away from grand reveals towards experimentation and showing little and often. Style prototypes are the next step along. They're basically element collages, but in code. They skip the sitting in Photoshop phase and enable you to mock up something really quickly for feedback. They're prototypes of some of the content elements on the page, but these are all mocked up in HTML rather than in Photoshop. So they adapt to different screen widths, and you can try it in the environment that it's designed for. And this gives a much more realistic representation of what the finished thing will feel like to use. Style prototypes help demonstrate how different styles will feel once they're in the browser. They capture things like button hover states and interactions in a very detailed and granular scale. And this is an ideal approach if you have a hybrid designer and developer on your team. The code doesn't have to be great, it's a prototype after all. And it's best to start building them during the design phase. It might seem strange to be coding so early on in a project, but it means that you can test ideas out quickly before writing proper code. You might already maintain a code standards document. So Harry Roberts is a front-end developer who has his own CSS guidelines, and it's been so popular that he's created an entire site for it. CSS guidelines are just one example. They could be written about HTML, PHP, basically whatever language that your site is written in. Ideally, they need to be written before you start building. In Harry's CSS guidelines, it contains not just how to format CSS in a consistent way, but why it should be done in this way. Coding standards should evolve over time in response to changes in specifications and accessibility best practice. A good set of guidelines will tell you what to do, so keep selectors as short as possible. A great set of guidelines will tell you why, so keep selectors as short as possible in order to keep specificity down and performance up. an excellent set of guidelines will go one step further and back up the reasoning with further reading. This is invaluable for new developers working on a team as it helps them learn best practices. If you're at a more stable part of a project where you're building out components, then something like a pattern primer, which is a term that Jeremy Keith of Clearleft likes to use, is going to be more useful as an ongoing piece of documentation. This is the main type of style guide that I'm going to be diving into, as the idea is that it's not a throwaway deliverable. It's a system, so a living, breathing, evolving library of components. Each component or module, each small piece of the design, is referred to as a pattern. And they're like Lego blocks. They are independent of each other and can live on their own or alongside other patterns to form pages. In this quote, Jeremy uses the term pattern library. A pattern primer is a pattern library. It's just what Jeremy likes to call his. And I think of a pattern library as a part of a front-end style guide, which might also include code standards and content guidelines, anything that's going to help someone to maintain a site. Before Natalie Down co-founded Lanyard, she was a front-end developer at Clearleft, and when she was developing a new pattern, she'd add it to a long page which had all the patterns on it, and she called this a pattern portfolio, and this is where Jeremy's primer evolved from. The difference between Natalie's version and Jeremy's is that Jeremy separates the patterns from the page template and shows the markup alongside the pattern. Pattern libraries are built using the same markup and the same styles as the live site to keep it as accurate a representation as possible of the site. But this is not the only deliverable that Jeremy gives to the client. He'll also mock up a few pages, but with the intention being that the client can use the pattern library to assemble new pages going forward. It might seem like a lot of work up front to get set up with a style guide, but as you'll see, they more than make up for it in the long term. The very act of preparing a style guide improves standards, so you're more likely to be self-critical about your decisions than if you didn't make one at all. When you're working with a really big site, the design and the code can get out of sync very quickly. And a style guide is a good check and balance. It's something that can be used to make sure that you're staying on track. And this is especially important if you have a sprawling site with multiple people working on it, like Starbucks. They have a pattern library, and it's really fantastic that they've made it public. It contains things like the grid system they use, various layout modes, dialog boxes, and form styles. This documentation is especially useful for when external teams are brought in to work on a site. Things like form validation styles can be reused, so Starbucks now don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they introduce a new section on their site. Or worse, have to duplicate code or styles that already exist. Interacting with inconsistent UIs across government websites is what spurred 18F to put together in a relatively short space of time the US web design standards. It's so exciting to see governments focusing on this, not just as a way to make sites less confusing to users, but also as a way to save public money, because they're not having to reinvent the wheel with every new site. What they've put together is a common set of UI elements that have already been usability tested and meet accessibility standards out of the box. And these components are intended to be reused to maintain visual consistency across US government websites. Alongside the patterns are guidelines on how to adapt them in a way that maintains these standards. What's incredible is seeing a government write up and share their research, which then directly influences the decisions that a different government's web team makes. So there's a Trello board for the first version of the US web design standards, and it's public. So you can see some of their discussions that went into designing components, like their date picker, which they've based directly off one that the UK government built and wrote about. They're not just open sourcing their code, they're also open sourcing their workflow and research. And this is what makes the industry great, people sharing knowledge and building things that have been proven to work rather than starting from scratch every time. Another benefit of style guides is when you use them as part of your QA flow, because everything's on one page, it's faster to test. So you can easily spot style conflicts and quickly drill down to a specific element that's causing things to break. Normally, markup is hidden behind view source, but by displaying the code alongside the pattern, your team can help spot errors in the code. And it's also going to encourage you to write better code if you're effectively showing it off to everyone. Another nice thing you can do is install a browser plugin called Totally, so that's with the L's replaced with ones, that toggles common accessibility issues, like color contrast. So here it's flagging up when my text doesn't contrast enough with the background to be easily readable to people with low vision. And because all of my patterns are in a style guide, I can test them all at once without having to go through every single template that I've built. So a few days ago, Jim Newbury wrote about testing pattern libraries. So testing isolated components is a lot more effective than testing whole pages, and your pattern library is a great testing tool. So you can implement visual regression testing, which can take a snapshot of a pattern and overlay that snapshot with one that you took before you made any changes. And it will highlight the changes. And this will flag up any unintentional changes, such as leaking CSS styles. Jim points out that there are limitations to this approach, but suggests combining these with manual tests and automated cross-browser tests. When you're rapidly iterating, a lot of inconsistencies can creep in. So when you do a code review, having all your modules in one place helps keep track of what's new, what's duplicate, and what's not being used. If you can build elements straight in code using something like style prototypes, you're going to give a much more realistic representation of what the design is going to look and feel like. And you can immediately show it on different devices and browsers and get an idea straight away of if something is going to work in practice and feed back any issues to the designer. One of the best ways to make sure your style guide is kept up to date is to have someone on the team who is kind of an evangelist of it, someone who keeps it in check and makes sure new patterns are always added to it. So there's an entire team at Marriott Hotel who just maintain their style guides. While most places are unlikely to be able to justify that, having someone on your team who is in charge of regularly checking the style guide is up to date and being maintained, at least in the first 3 months, is going to go a long way. GitHub, they hire a lot of developers and they maintain their own standards for writing HTML and CSS and organizing files and the reasoning why they do particular things. And this makes the onboarding process for new employees a lot easier because they can just point them to these documents. Education is a really important aspect of documentation and can help advance best practice. So write up why you've done something a particular way and others will follow. Reflect on the techniques that you've adopted. Are they still worth following, or are they merely the way that you've always done things? Style guides can also be used to measure how much different features are going to affect performance. So Dan Moore worked with Tim Kadlec on Radio Free Europe's redesign, and they were told that because of the nature of the content, some of the site's users had been jailed or hanged just for accessing the site. So performance in this project was critical. They were thinking about it during the design phase as they were building up an element collage. When they started building, Tim created a grunt task which measured how fast each pattern is loading. Lonely Planet also think a lot about performance. So each file has performance stats logged in the style guide, and changes to these are highlighted and plotted on a graph. This is a great way of visualizing which areas can be optimized to make the most impact. And since this is all public, it also creates more of an incentive to optimize aggressively, and its prominence hopefully prevents file sizes from creeping up too much with each release. Pattern libraries are a fantastic tool for rapid prototyping. So Federico, who works at MailChimp, used theirs as a way to quickly build up new pages or update existing patterns. he managed to test out an idea using real code that was also responsive in just 20 minutes. And he did this by slotting together existing patterns. But no matter how good your pattern library or documentation is, it's not a replacement for talking to the client or the rest of your team. This isn't just something you're going to build, hand over, and that's it. Dan Moore has adopted the goal that every deliverable that he hands over has to come with a proper conversation. Also, don't wait until the end of the project to build one. Start putting it together from day one, otherwise it's likely to be this snapshot in time that people are less likely to maintain because they don't feel invested in it. This is why it's so important to get the designers involved in making and maintaining it. Like Gina says, if it's not part of your workflow, you're asking for it to become outdated. That being said, you can still make one if the site already exists. So this is one I knocked up for a list apart long after the site had gone live to help keep track of what styles there are. It's important to think about who you're building your style guide for. So is it for developers? Is it for an editorial team adding content to a CMS? Because that will dictate what kind of a message that you choose to convey. You should also consider how strict you want it to be. So are they a set of guidelines that are open to interpretation, or are they rules that need to be followed? I tend to lean towards more relaxed guidelines, but it will really depend on the project. This is Code for America's style guide. Each design pattern that appears on this site is built in isolation, and multiple patterns can be assembled together like Lego blocks. They have a microsite for each city, so their guidelines are very relaxed because they wanted to allow people more creativity in appropriating their city's microsite to reflect its individual needs and culture. So here's the information that's shown on each pattern. Each pattern has a unique name that the team can refer to. The pattern itself is displayed at full width, with the idea being that it can adapt into any space. It has the code that you would need to write to reproduce the pattern, a description of when the pattern is appropriate to use. So here I'm explaining that this pattern should be used as a call to action, and a link to the pattern on its own page for debugging purposes. Each individual pattern is a discrete file, a bit like an include file in PHP. And you can even keep them in an includes folder if you want. So everything is self-contained so that if the pattern becomes obsolete, the components can be removed easily. And if you're using something like SAS or less, these files should have the same name as the pattern files so they're easier to find, and so that you can see that the matching files are related. The style guide uses the compiled version of the main site styles so that it's the same on the website. But I also add some CSS just for the style guide, which I don't include in the production site. And I prefix all the class names on the style guide, so things like the pattern wrapper, with .xx, so that they'll never clash with the main site styles. I then set up a function that loops through all the patterns in the library and spits them out onto one page. And I add things like color swatches and typography straight into the style guide, as I'm not going to reuse these components anywhere on the production site. I then add some code to the function that outputs the markup for that pattern next to the pattern itself. The width of the patterns should be independent of each layout so that you can fit them into any space. And that way, if any of the layouts change, then you won't have to update the patterns. They'll just work anywhere. And this technique is essential for responsive websites. So I've been working on my own Jekyll version of a pattern library. Jekyll is a static site generator that also plays nicely with GitHub Pages, which hosts my site. So when I commit a change to the style guide, that change automatically gets pushed to the live site. So the patterns live in a Jekyll collection, which means I can loop through all the files and output them all on one page. And I've also added content in the YAML front matter of each file, which gets displayed as part of the pattern. I then have a grunt task that copies the pattern files into the includes folder and strips out the YAML so that I can use exactly the same patterns on the site as are in the style guide. And that way my style guide is always in sync with the site. Brad Frost and Dave Olson have created Pattern Lab, which is structured using the atomic design methodology. Brad defines atoms as basic building blocks that are not particularly useful on their own, such as a button for a search box, an input field, or a label. Modules are atoms that have been combined to form a specific function. So, for example, by combining the button, the input, and the label, we can make a search form. Organisms are groups of modules combined together, such as the search form in a site header alongside some navigation. Thinking of design patterns in an atomic way makes what we build more flexible. We assume that the same atoms and modules could be combined in many different ways, in combinations that we might not have even imagined when building them. So splitting things up in this way helps users of an atomic pattern library understand how modules are assembled. Separating the modules from the layout helps make a site more maintainable. If the layout changes, such as increased column width, modules can simply expand to fill it. So there are some tools out there that will even generate a style guide based on comments in your CSS. So KSS, which stands for Canal Style Sheets, does this, with the aim to make your style guide easier to maintain. So you write comments in this way with the various dates, and KSS will look for these and generate a style guide from them. Tools like Frontify do a similar job, so they generate a style guide for you, displaying things like swatches and typography used. They also have a discussion feature, and this is good for if your team works remotely or if your client works off-site and you want to make communication as clear and collaborative as possible. It's so important that your style guide is available from outside the internal network, because often external agencies will need to use it. And people are also more likely to use it if it's really easily accessible. My favorite tool is Typecast because it promotes a content-first approach. I'm not sure if it can really be called a style guide. It doesn't do stuff like generate color swatches for you, but it's great as a first step towards making one. It's purely for prototyping typography and helping build a solid foundation in the browser. Padding, margin, and line heights can be tweaked, and it generates fairly decent CSS. As you know, Photoshop is terrible at showing what typefaces will actually look like in the browser, so please, designers, use Typecast instead. So there are a few key features that your front-end style guide should have, as well as some optional ones. Before you do anything, just start with the basics. So just raw HTML without any CSS classes, so things like heading levels, default paragraphs, links, tables, form input boxes. You can reuse this HTML on any project, and it's great to sit right down with the designer and tweak things with them, like the line heights, to make sure you've got a really decent typographic grounding for the site. So I use Paul Lloyd's Bare Bones, which has all the raw HTML elements, along with an explanation of when you can use them. The design is nice and minimal, so you might also want to use his CSS as a starting point. After you've put in some basic elements, start adding the patterns. Aim to only include the patterns that you need. It's tempting to show everything in your boilerplate, but be realistic. While it's nice to have, most sites are unlikely to ever need a style for the keyboard element. I'm quite guilty of this. I like to add everything that I can think of to my style guides just in case, but it doesn't help make the code any leaner. So I have a toolbox at home that is full of things I don't use. It has multiple things that I have more than one of, parts of furniture I don't have anymore, and things I've kept just in case I might need them. MailChimp's style guide says that they only add new patterns when there's a sound case for doing so, because new patterns come at a high cost in terms of design elements, additional code, and maintenance. They say that new patterns also increase the cognitive load on users, and I get that cognitive load when I'm searching for a particular tool in my toolbox. They know that the more that they add to their pattern library, the more features they're going to have to support and the more complex the library and the site gets. So they only build patterns that are needed. Alongside your patterns, show the markup that's needed to replicate it. So this is Salesforce's style guide, and they have a fantastically detailed design system documentation. So I like to put my code behind a kind of show hide so that the page doesn't get too long. But Salesforce, they have so many patterns that they split them onto multiple pages, so they make all their markup visible on the page. So this is usually HTML, but really it should be whatever language that someone who is building the site would need to recreate that pattern. South Tees Hospital, their website is built in WordPress, so their code examples are WordPress shortcode. Someone without any knowledge of HTML can easily add components to a new page in the WordPress editor view without having to open up a code editor. And it also means that if the markup changes further down the line, the shortcode should stay the same. You may also want to show the CSS. Salesforce actually display their Sass used for the patterns. I wonder how useful this is because unlike the markup, a pattern CSS in isolation is missing the global styles, so it's not possible to replicate using just that snippet. But it is useful as a learning tool for other people to see how it's made. Don't forget to show the extremes, such as this really long heading which I've put in to make sure that it doesn't look really weird when the text wraps. And also show what happens when people do things that the designer might not have anticipated, like having two headings next to each other. As you go, check that the patterns work on different devices and different browsers, and also make a habit of switching off JavaScript to make sure that your fallbacks work. Adding notes is especially useful for back-end developers who need to understand the logic to certain styles. So here there are groups that could be of any three states to signify whether it's a public group, which is a default state, or a private group, or a group that the user is already a member of. So there are some notes explaining what these three different styles actually mean. Color swatches are a really nice thing to add to a style guide. So for Code for America's style guide, each color has its own name, hex code, and RGB value. And if I'm using Sass or less, I also like to include the variable name so I can quickly reference it when I'm coding. I've also seen some really lovely examples of grids in style guides, like Starbucks, which has toggles for showing the grid as a layer, like you can do in Photoshop. And it's ideal for checking whether something is lining up properly. If you've got animations on your site, document these too to keep the styles and timings consistent, and write up when to use specific ones. Something that is frequently neglected on a site is right-to-left styles. So for this style guide, I added a right-to-left toggle that switched the text direction of all of the patterns. And that way I could easily see if I'd written my CSS in a way that broke the design for languages that are displayed in this way. After a while, your style guide is going to get pretty long, so you might want to drop in some navigation like a jump link select box or some navigation to the side. I tend to prefer jump links for shorter libraries because I like the patterns to fill the full width of the screen so that I can test that they respond nicely at very big sizes without the navigation getting in the way. A style guide that's out of date is almost as useless as no style guide at all. And the challenge for the coming months and years is making ones that are powered by the live site that use the same styles, the same content, and the same code base. A lot of style guides are built separately from the site, and the code can get out of sync over time. And Gina calls these zombie style guides when they're unloved and unmaintained. So don't let your style guide become a zombie style guide. Lonely Planet have a really clever strategy for stopping theirs becoming zombified. They've hooked it up to an API, meaning the markup used is synced with the live site. And they call their system Rizzo. Rather than have HTML snippets, they display the code needed to pull in the markup. To show you an example, this code outputs a card with a cover image. The parameters can be modified to change the output. So taking this example, if we wanted to show the same pattern but with an author credit, we can add a couple of lines for the author name and avatar and they appear. And this tackles a problem where components may become out of date, such as if the markup changes. And it also means that if you have multiple components that share a lot of the same markup, you're not duplicating the code. Ian Feather, formerly of Lonely Planet, credits the success of their style guide to this API. And he mentioned that he'd built 2 versions before this one that became zombie style guides. But now it has an API, it's always up to date, and he doesn't have to actively maintain it. If you don't have a fancy style guide that automatically updates, you'll need to add it to your workflow somehow. So at SNCC, the company that I work for, we're using KSS for our style guide, the one with the CSS comments. It means that we have to add some code comments in the CSS to get the component to display in the style guide. But we kept forgetting to do this, so I've added a checkbox to our GitHub pull request template that people have to tick to confirm that a new feature they've created has been added to the style guide. Every time someone creates a pull request on this repo, they are reminded to do this. And I've also done the same with internal documentation. So I've added a checkbox asking if documentation about the new feature has been written. And it means we're not adding undocumented features to our code base. It takes just a minute to set up and is really a really helpful reminder. Even the best style guides can be improved, and it feels like everyone is still seeking that holy grail, the style guide that needs minimal maintenance, that everyone feels invested in, that's easy to update, and that stays up to date. That's usually a lot easier for an in-house team to achieve than an agency who hand a style guide over as deliverable. So Dan Moore talked to me about baking in time after the project to revisit the style guides that they delivered to their clients. And I think this is brave because it's admitting that the system that they've delivered is probably not going to be perfect the first time round. They use this time to see what's working, what's not working, how they can be improved, and make tweaks based on this feedback. I think this should be true for any project. It's not right to just throw a bunch of documentation at a client, hope for the best, and then dust your hands of it. And I just want to stress the value of making it public. Other than being a really nice thing to do that helps the community, there are some very good reasons for this. One is that it keeps you honest. You're going to be much more likely to maintain the thing if other people can see it. And the second thing is that it's a recruitment tool. Several people I've talked to have said that they've joined a company after seeing their style guide. If you build one and it's good, you're going to have people like Gina knocking at your door. Lonely Planet's style guide has also helped them with recruitment, and by making their tool Rizzo open source, it means that some of their new recruits are already familiar with working with the tool before they've even started. And it also opens the doors to people outside of your organization to make improvements to your overall design and code. So a week after the US Web Design Standards went live, Maya retweeted that they'd merged 9 pull requests from people outside of the government. My final piece of advice is, don't be intimidated by how all of these examples look. It doesn't have to be a work of art. That's not the point. Sure, it helps if it looks nice because people will feel more proud of it, but it's meant as a tool. Start small and simple and build upon it as and when you can. So if you want to know more, I set up a repository on GitHub that brings together the stuff about style guides. Over 300 resources have been added by the community. And you might want to check this out if you're looking for more ideas and inspiration on creating a front-end style guide. And I also run a little podcast with Brad Frost about style guides. It was just a short-run thing with a total of 12 guests, and a lot of the quotes that were in this presentation were directly from that. And I've written a book about it, and it's £2 and goes into a lot more detail about everything that I've just been talking about.
Please give it up for Anna Debenham.